In the spring of 1894, something was terribly wrong in the far north of Nevada. Not because of the fire. Not because of the drought. But because of what the fire forced people to see. For nearly 15 years, a man lived on a forgotten piece of land in Humboldt County, unseen, unquestioned, and untouched. He spoke little. He paid in cash. He came to town just often enough to avoid suspicion. And when people tried to remember him later, they realized something chilling. No one could remember how many children he had. Some said 2, others said 3, a few swore they had seen 4. But no one could remember them clearly. And that was the most disturbing part of all. This is the story of the Brennick Farm. And the children who lived there in silence. In 1894, Humboldt County was harsh, dry, and unforgiving. The land north of Winnemucca stretched endlessly, broken only by rock formations, scrub brush, and abandoned mining scars. A short-lived silver boom had collapsed years earlier, leaving behind empty cabins and dreams that died quickly in the desert heat. Only the desperate stayed. Cornelius Brennick was one of them. He purchased his land in 1879, shortly after a nearby silver mine failed. The price was almost nothing. The location was nearly unreachable. The trail to the farm became mud in winter and dust in summer. During heavy rains, it vanished completely. His nearest neighbor lived almost 5 miles away. Cornelius Brennick liked it that way. For years, he existed as little more than a rumor. Merchants in Winnemucca remembered a thin, serious man who never lingered. He bought flour, beans, salt, and tools. Always paid in cash. Always left quickly. Sometimes children stood behind him. Their faces were quiet. Their clothes plain. Their eyes never met anyone else's. Over the years, people noticed something strange. The children did not seem to age normally. One year, the oldest looked 10. Years later, she still looked 10. Or perhaps she was a different child altogether. No one asked questions. On the frontier, family arrangements were not discussed. Then came the drought. By early April of 1894, the land had dried to tinder. Grass crumbled at the touch. Trees stood brittle and lifeless. When a fire ignited in the eastern mountains, it spread with terrifying speed. Within days, thousands of acres burned. The sheriff ordered evacuations of all rural properties in the fire's projected path. Deputy Sheriff Donald Frost was assigned to the northern routes. On the morning of April 16, Frost and 2 volunteers rode toward the Brennick property. Smoke darkened the sky, and ash drifted through the air like falling snow. Even miles away from the fire, the smell of burning wood was overwhelming. When they reached the farm, Frost immediately noticed signs of recent life. Smoke rose from the chimney. Clothes hung neatly on a line. Tools were arranged beside a small barn with unusual precision. But the house was silent. Frost called out loudly, identifying himself. There was no answer. He knocked. Again, nothing. Something felt wrong. He circled the property, scanning the fields. That was when he saw them. 4 children worked in perfect rows, tending crops with slow, exact movements. They pulled weeds, placed tools down, and shifted position with mechanical accuracy. They made no sound, no talking, no laughter, no complaints. As Frost approached, every child froze instantly. Not slowly, not cautiously, instantly. Tools remained suspended in midair. Bodies stiffened. None of them turned to look at him. It was as if someone had pressed a switch. Frost spoke gently, explaining who he was and why he was there. The fire, the evacuation, the danger. After several seconds, the oldest child slowly turned her head. She was a thin adolescent girl, with dark hair loosely tied back. Her eyes were hollow, not frightened, not confused, empty. Without speaking, she lifted one hand and made a small gesture toward the house. Then she returned to her work as if nothing had happened. The other 3 children never moved. Frost instructed his companions to stay with them while he returned to the house. This time, the door opened. Cornelius Brennick stood just inside, opening the door only enough for his face to appear. He was medium height, with sharp features and uneven gray hair. His eyes were alert, calculating, and cold. Frost explained the evacuation order. Cornelius listened without reaction. When Frost finished, Cornelius nodded once and said he would gather his children. No questions. No concern. No urgency. Minutes later, the children stood in a straight line outside the house. Each held a small cloth bag. Their spacing was exact, their posture identical, their eyes fixed on the ground. One small hand gesture from Cornelius was all it took. They began walking toward the wagon in perfect synchronization. Frost had never seen children move like that. The journey to Winnemucca took 3 hours. Frost tried to speak to them. He asked their names, their ages, if they were scared. Silence. Each time a question was asked, the children glanced briefly at Cornelius before lowering their eyes again. Permission was never given. Cornelius answered only when necessary. His responses were short and precise. Something did not add up. The children were clearly different ages. But their clothing was nearly identical. More troubling, they did not resemble each other at all. Different hair colors, different facial structures, different skin tones. They did not look like siblings. When they arrived in town, the contrast was immediate. Other evacuated families were loud, emotional, confused. Children cried, ran, and asked questions. The Brennick children sat in a straight line exactly where Cornelius told them to sit. Local women offered food and water. Each child waited for Cornelius to signal before accepting. Even then, they ate slowly, carefully, without expression. Helen Pritchard, a schoolteacher, tried to speak to the oldest girl. She received no response. Not a word, not a glance. Helen later told Frost she had never seen behavior like this. Not even in orphanages. Not even in abused children. This was conditioning. Frost requested official records. Names. Birth dates. Mothers' names. Cornelius answered smoothly. Ida, Nora, Virgil, Clyde. But as Frost wrote them down, a cold realization settled in. This was not a family hiding from the world. This was something far worse. And the fire had only just begun to expose it. If you want, I can next provide Part 2 with deeper psychological horror. SEO title description and viral hashtags. Or 3 powerful thumbnail text options for YouTube. Part 2. The lies that almost worked. At first glance, Cornelius Brennick's story made perfect sense. Too perfect. In 1894, widowed men raising children alone were common. Childbirth was dangerous. Records were scattered. Mining towns vanished overnight. A man could move across states and leave very little behind. That was the problem. Cornelius Brennick's story fit the era so well that it felt rehearsed. Deputy Frost requested basic information for evacuation records. Full names, birth dates, mothers' names. Cornelius answered without hesitation, as if reciting something memorized long ago. Ida, 16, Nora, 13, Virgil, 10, Clyde, 7. Each child, he claimed, came from a different marriage. Each mother had died during or shortly after childbirth. No grandparents, no siblings, no surviving relatives. A clean story. Convenient, tragic but believable. What unsettled Frost was not what Cornelius said, but how he said it. There was no emotion, no softening of voice, no hesitation when speaking of 4 dead women he claimed to have loved. The names of the mothers were delivered with the same flat tone as the children's ages. As the afternoon passed, the children remained exactly as they had been since arrival. They did not wander. They did not speak. They did not watch the other children play. They sat where Cornelius placed them and stayed there. When Cornelius stood, all 4 children stiffened instantly. Their bodies became alert, as if preparing for orders that might or might not come. Helen Pritchard could no longer ignore it. She brought paper and pencils, hoping drawing might help them communicate. She placed the materials in front of Ida and smiled gently. Ida stared at them as if they were foreign objects. Helen carefully guided Ida's hand toward the pencil. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Ida ripped her hand away with violent force. A low, animal sound came from her throat. Not a scream, not a word, something deeper and more primal. The other 3 children collapsed inward at the same time. Shoulders hunched, heads tucked, arms raised in identical defensive positions. Cornelius stood instantly. He placed himself between Helen and the children without touching her or raising his voice. He said nothing. He did not need to. The threat was unspoken but absolute. Helen stepped back, apologizing instinctively. Cornelius nodded once. The children relaxed immediately. That moment sealed it for Frost. This was not discipline. This was control built on fear. Frost sent a telegram requesting verification of Cornelius Brennick's records. As night fell, evacuated families prepared to sleep. The Brennick children did not move until Cornelius gestured. Only then did they lie down, arranging themselves in precise alignment. Even asleep, their bodies remained rigid. Frost barely slept. He watched them for hours, his mind racing. 3 days later, the telegram response arrived. There were no birth records for any Brennick children in Humboldt County. No marriage records for Cornelius Brennick in the past 20 years. No church registrations. No midwife entries. Nothing. The only official records were his land purchase in 1879 and scattered commercial transactions. Sheriff Daniel Cartwright had arrived to oversee evacuation operations. When Frost presented the findings, Cartwright's expression darkened. With 15 years of experience, he knew when something demanded attention. They asked Cornelius to speak privately. He did not resist. He followed calmly. Before leaving, he made a small gesture. The children instantly became even more rigid. Inside the room, Cartwright began casually, asking about farming practices and property maintenance. Cornelius answered smoothly, technically, without warmth. When asked about the mothers, he repeated the same story. Different marriages, different towns, same outcome. When Cartwright mentioned the absence of records, Cornelius paused. Just for a fraction of a second. His shoulders tightened slightly. He explained that mining life was transient. Records were often lost. Marriages happened quickly. Death followed just as fast. It was plausible, too plausible. Frost changed direction and asked about schooling. Cornelius said he educated the children himself. Reading, writing, arithmetic, enough to function. Formal education was unnecessary. When asked about friends, Cornelius replied that isolation protected children from corrupt influences. Cartwright pressed further, asking what influences concerned him. Cornelius spoke with conviction. Modern society weakened children. Cities bred dependency. Hard labor built character. Obedience built strength. The words themselves were not illegal. But the cold certainty behind them was unsettling. Then Cartwright asked if he could speak to the children individually. For the first time, Cornelius showed real emotion. His jaw tightened. His fists clenched. He hesitated before answering. He said the children were extremely shy. That separation would distress them. Cartwright informed him that as sheriff, he had authority to verify their well-being. After a tense pause, Cornelius agreed. Brief interviews only. He would stay nearby. Cartwright refused that condition. They started with Ida. When she was separated from Cornelius, her entire body began to shake. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning doors and windows. Not for people, for escape. Helen offered water. Ida did not respond. Simple questions followed. Slowly, Ida began nodding yes or no. When asked if Cornelius was her father, she hesitated before nodding. The motion looked automatic. Had Cornelius ever hurt her? Ida froze completely. Was she afraid of him? No response. Would she like to live somewhere else? Her eyes filled with tears that never fell. Helen asked to see her hands. Ida extended them mechanically. They were covered in thick calluses. Heavy labor calluses. Years old. Scars crisscrossed her fingers and wrists. Some looked accidental. Others were disturbingly uniform. When asked about the scars, Ida yanked her hands away. She rocked back and forth, making low sounds again. The interview ended. The moment Ida saw Cornelius waiting outside, her panic vanished. She walked to him and stood at his side. Empty again. The other interviews followed the same pattern. Nora showed identical fear and scars. Virgil barely spoke or gestured at all. Clyde copied the others perfectly, despite barely understanding what was happening. None could describe daily life. None mentioned mothers. None spoke of memories. Cartwright met with Frost and Helen. The law gave fathers near absolute authority. Psychological harm alone was not enough. Then a merchant spoke up. He remembered Cornelius from Montana. Silver Bow County. He remembered because Cornelius bought chains and padlocks in unusual quantities. Cartwright sent telegrams immediately. The response arrived 8 days later. Cornelius Brennick had lived in Montana in the 1870s. He had taken in 3 children informally. All 3 died before age 8. One doctor had documented malnutrition and repeated fractures. No charges were filed. Cornelius left Montana shortly after. Now Cartwright had cause. A warrant was issued to inspect the Brennick property. The next morning, they returned to the farm. The fire had passed, leaving blackened earth around an untouched house. Inside, everything was arranged with military precision. No toys, no books, no signs of childhood. 4 identical rooms, thin mattresses, wooden chests. Inside the chests were identical clothes. Frost noticed deep scratch marks inside one door. All doors had once been locked from the outside. Then they opened the trap door to the basement. And what waited below would finally expose the true purpose of the Brennick farm. If you want, I can continue with Part 3, going fully into the basement discovery. Part 3. The basement was never meant to be found. The trap door was not locked. That was the first thing that terrified Sheriff Cartwright. If Cornelius Brennick had believed his work was wrong, he would have hidden it. He would have buried it. He would have feared discovery. Instead, the door waited calmly in the kitchen floor, as if it had always expected someone to open it. When Cartwright lifted the wooden panel, a wave of stench rushed upward. It was overpowering. Mold, urine, rot, and beneath it all, a sickeningly sweet odor that no one needed explained. The staircase leading down was steep and narrow. The wooden steps were deeply worn, not from age alone, but from frequent use. Someone had gone up and down these stairs many times. The doctor hesitated before descending. He covered his mouth and nose with a handkerchief. Even then, his face tightened in visible distress. The basement extended beneath the entire house. It was not chaotic. It was organized. That was the most disturbing part. The first section looked like a workshop. Tools were arranged with obsessive precision. Agricultural supplies were stacked neatly. Everything had its place. Then Frost saw the chains. Heavy iron chains bolted directly into the walls at different heights. Shackles lay on shelves, some small enough for children's wrists and ankles. There were boards with carved notches and drilled holes, shaped and sanded with care. These were not improvised restraints. They were designed. The doctor examined the metal closely. The wear marks showed repeated use over many years. No one spoke. They moved to the second area. At first, it looked like a simple depression in the dirt floor. But closer inspection revealed it had been deliberately expanded. The pit was about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. Too deep to climb out of. Too shallow to stand. Heavy wooden boards were stacked nearby. Each board had small drilled holes spaced evenly across the surface. The doctor knelt and examined the pit. The dirt walls were scratched raw. Fingernail marks ran vertically, deep and frantic. At the bottom were dark stains that time had not erased. Blood. Frost felt his stomach turn as understanding set in. This pit was not meant to kill. It was meant to keep someone alive. The boards would be placed over the top, sealing the victim inside. The holes allowed air, but barely. Enough to survive, not enough to be comfortable. No light, no movement, no dignity. Calculated suffering. They stood in silence before moving on. The third area revealed the true heart of Cornelius Brennick's world. Shelves lined the walls, holding leather-bound notebooks. Dozens of them, each labeled by date, each perfectly aligned. Cartwright opened the most recent one. What he read changed everything. Cornelius had documented the children's lives in meticulous detail. Wake times, assigned labor, meals, discipline, but he did not refer to them by name. They were subjects, or numbers. Punishments were recorded clinically. No anger, no cruelty in tone, only justification. One entry described Subject 1 being placed in the confinement pit for 72 hours after expressing independent thoughts. Cornelius noted water delivery through a tube and regular checks to ensure survival. Not concern. Verification. Other entries described rules. Speaking without permission resulted in food deprivation. Eye contact resulted in darkness confinement. Emotional expression resulted in forced labor until exhaustion. Cornelius was not raising children. He was conducting an experiment. Then Cartwright found the pages detailing acquisition. Ida had been purchased for $50 from a starving widow in Carson City. Nora had been handed over by a widowed miner in Virginia City who could not care for an infant. Virgil had been taken from a workers' camp after his mother died of typhus. Cornelius had simply offered help. No one questioned him. Clyde had been obtained from an immigrant family during a brutal winter. Food and shelter in exchange for a child. Every case followed the same pattern. Desperation, isolation, no one to ask questions later. Cornelius had forged documents, invented marriages, fabricated deaths. But the most horrifying section came near the back of the shelves. Subjects with letters. Subject A, discontinued due to constitutional weakness. Subject B, adaptation failure, removed from program. Subject C, medical complications resulted in premature termination. No ages, no burial locations, just conclusions. Cartwright ordered the exterior searched immediately. The team spread out, scanning for disturbed soil. Behind the barn, a deputy noticed uneven ground partially hidden by brush. They began digging. Less than 3 feet down, the shovel struck something solid. Small bones. The doctor examined them quietly. A child, buried years ago. They found another grave 20 yards away. Then another. Some contained partial remains. Time and animals had done their work. But the pattern was unmistakable. Shallow graves. No markers. No prayers. By the next day, they had identified evidence of at least 7 burials. Possibly more. The notebooks were cross-referenced. Subjects that disappeared from records matched estimated burial timelines. Cornelius Brennick had been perfecting his system for decades. When Cartwright returned to town with the findings, Cornelius was arrested immediately. For the first time since being discovered, Cornelius spoke with emotion. Not fear, anger. He claimed the children would fail without him. That the world would corrupt them. That he was saving them from weakness. He never denied the pit. He never denied the chains. He said they were necessary. The children were placed under protective custody. Doctors began documenting physical and psychological damage. The calluses, the scars, the malnutrition, the arrested development. But the deeper wounds would take far longer to surface. Ida would later describe the pit as the quiet place. A place where thoughts disappeared. And as the investigation continued, authorities would discover that Brennick's influence extended further than anyone imagined. Because the farm was not the end. It was the center. And Cornelius Brennick was not finished trying to control his subjects. Not even from behind bars. If you want to know what happened next, subscribe to the channel and stay with this story. Part 4 reveals what Cornelius truly believed he was creating. And why the children feared something even worse than the pit. If you want, I can continue with Part 4, or prepare SEO title description viral hashtags and thumbnail text for Parts 1 through 3 together. Part 4. The children did not know how to be free. Freedom should have felt like relief. For the Brennick children, it felt like danger. The day Cornelius Brennick was taken away in handcuffs, the town expected tears, screams, or celebration. Instead, the 4 children reacted in ways no one was prepared for. Ida did not cry. She stood perfectly still, eyes locked on the doorway Cornelius had passed through. Her face held no expression, but her body trembled almost invisibly, as if resisting an order that never came. Nora collapsed inward, curling her arms around her head and rocking silently. Virgil pressed himself into a corner, refusing to let anyone come near. Clyde screamed for hours until his voice broke, calling a word no one expected. Father. Doctors and townspeople struggled to understand it. Cornelius had tortured them, controlled them, broken them, yet he was all they knew. Helen Pritchard took responsibility for their care under county supervision. She prepared a quiet home away from crowds, believing safety and patience would help. She was wrong. The first night without Cornelius, the children did not sleep. They sat on the floor in formation, backs straight, eyes open, waiting. Helen gently encouraged them to lie down. Ida shook her head. No permission. Hours passed. When exhaustion finally overcame them, they collapsed where they sat. At dawn, they woke instantly at the sound of a door closing outside. All four jumped to their feet in perfect synchronization. Doctors soon realized the children had internalized Cornelius so deeply that even his absence controlled them. They asked permission before eating. They flinched when spoken to. They refused soft beds, choosing the floor instead. When Helen removed the locks from bedroom doors, the children became visibly distressed. Locked doors meant safety to them. Unlocked doors meant unpredictability. The county doctor began documenting symptoms. Severe developmental delay, extreme obedience reflex, absence of spontaneous speech, self-punishment behaviors. Most alarming was their fear of making choices. When asked what they wanted to eat, Ida began shaking. When given clothing options, Nora panicked. Choice itself felt dangerous. Meanwhile, Cornelius Brennick awaited trial in the county jail. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not deny the evidence. Instead, he requested writing materials. Cartwright allowed it, believing it harmless. That decision would haunt him. Cornelius began writing letters. Not to the court, not to officials, to the children. He framed them as lessons. Helen intercepted the first letter before it reached Ida. It was written in calm, precise language. It warned her that independence led to weakness. That strangers lied. That obedience was protection. That pain was temporary but failure was permanent. Helen burned the letter. Cornelius wrote another. And another. Cartwright immediately prohibited further contact, but the damage had already been done. Ida had sensed it. That night, she refused food and water. She stood in the corner for hours as if punishing herself. When Helen gently touched her shoulder, Ida whispered something for the first time since the separation. I disobeyed. Helen realized Cornelius was still controlling them. From a cell, the trial preparation moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Chains, the pit, the notebooks, the graves. But the prosecution faced a challenge. Cornelius claimed he never intended to kill. He argued the deaths were unfortunate but natural. He insisted his methods were strict but necessary. Under the laws of the time, proving intent was critical. Doctors testified about the psychological damage, about the scars, about the pit. The notebooks became the most powerful evidence. Cornelius had recorded suffering as data. That removed any doubt, yet Cornelius showed no remorse. During questioning, he spoke openly about his beliefs. Children were raw material. Discipline created strength. Compassion created weakness. He claimed society had failed the children before he found them. That he had given them purpose. When asked about the graves, he said calmly that not all subjects were suitable. The courtroom fell silent. The judge ordered the children not to testify. Doctors argued it would destroy them. Still, Cornelius demanded to see them one last time. The request was denied. That denial broke something inside him. For the first time, Cornelius shouted. He accused the town of stealing his work, of corrupting his subjects, of condemning them to failure. The trial lasted 8 days. Cornelius Brennick was found guilty on multiple counts of abuse, unlawful confinement, and murder. The sentence was life imprisonment. He was transferred to the Nevada State Prison. But the story did not end there. Within weeks of his incarceration, strange incidents began occurring. Ida began waking at night screaming. Nora refused to sleep alone. Virgil began reenacting work routines obsessively. Clyde developed a habit of whispering numbers under his breath. Doctors feared the damage was permanent. Then Helen found something disturbing. One of Cornelius's notebooks was missing. No one could explain how. The prison denied allowing him access to previous writings. Yet somehow, one notebook had not been catalogued. And someone had mailed pages from it. The package arrived with no return address. Inside were instructions, punishments, rules, language identical to what Cornelius used. Helen realized someone was helping him. Or someone had learned from him. Authorities began investigating possible accomplices. Former acquaintances. People who had interacted with Cornelius over the years. Then another discovery emerged. A farmer in eastern Oregon came forward. He claimed he had once taken in a quiet man who helped with labor years earlier. The man believed in strict discipline. He had spoken about raising children properly. About isolation. About control. The man's name had been Cornelius Brennick. But he had not been alone. He had been teaching. The realization spread like poison. Cornelius may not have been unique. He may have been part of something larger. Or worse, an idea that could spread. As investigators expanded the search, Helen faced a more immediate crisis. Ida had begun enforcing rules on the others. Correcting posture, restricting speech, withholding food if someone disobeyed. She was becoming what Cornelius had shaped her to be. Helen stopped it immediately, but the damage was visible. Cornelius had not only controlled them, he had planted himself inside them. Breaking that control would take years, possibly a lifetime. And as Cornelius sat in his cell, writing letters that were never sent, one thing became clear. The Brennick Farm was not just a place. It was a system, and systems do not die easily. In Part 5, the investigation uncovers whether Cornelius truly acted alone, and what terrifying connections his past may reveal across the frontier. If you want to continue this story, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because what comes next is even darker than the farm itself. Part 5. Cornelius was not the beginning. The most frightening discovery came weeks after Cornelius Brennick was locked behind stone walls. Nothing changed. Not for the children, not for the nightmares, not for the quiet feeling that something was still watching. Helen Pritchard had believed that once Cornelius was gone, the control would slowly fade. That the fear would loosen its grip. That time and kindness would heal what cruelty had broken. Instead, the shadows grew longer. Ida began waking before dawn, standing silently at the foot of the other children's beds. She corrected their posture with small gestures. She watched their hands while they ate. When Nora hesitated or Virgil moved too slowly, Ida would withhold food without anger or hesitation. She was not being cruel. She was following rules. Helen intervened immediately, separating Ida from authority. But the behavior did not disappear. It retreated. It adapted. The county doctor called it internalized dominance. Cornelius no longer needed to speak. He had trained replacements. Meanwhile, Sheriff Cartwright expanded the investigation beyond Nevada. The farmer from Oregon had given them a name and a place, but his memory was vague. Years had passed, faces blurred, but records remained. Telegram by telegram, Cartwright reached out to sheriffs and clerks across mining territories. Montana, Idaho, Utah, Colorado. The responses were slow and deeply unsettling. In 3 counties, officials recalled a quiet man who avoided towns and kept children hidden. He worked briefly, left suddenly, paid cash, asked about land far from neighbors. In 2 places, children had died under unclear circumstances shortly after he left. Nothing had ever been proven. No charges filed. Frontier justice had limits. Then came the letter from Utah. A midwife reported something that froze Cartwright in place. In 1884, a man matching Cornelius's description had arrived with a pregnant woman who was not his wife. The woman died during childbirth. The man claimed the child, paid for burial, left within days. The midwife remembered him because he asked detailed questions. Not about the baby's health. About when obedience could begin. This pattern repeated again and again. Cornelius Brennick did not stumble into cruelty. He planned it. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became. Cornelius believed he was perfecting something. A method, a system. Children taken young enough to forget life before him. Isolation to erase comparison. Labor to exhaust resistance. Punishment to remove thought. Obedience to replace identity. What terrified Cartwright most was not what Cornelius had done. It was that it worked. At least partially. Doctors documented slow progress with the children. Clyde began speaking in full sentences. Virgil allowed himself to play briefly with wooden blocks. Nora laughed once. A short sound. Surprised even herself. Ida did not change. She watched. She remembered. One afternoon, Helen found Ida sitting alone, carefully arranging small stones in precise lines on the floor. "What are you doing?" Helen asked gently. Ida answered without hesitation. "Order makes things safe." That night, Ida whispered something else. "He said if he stopped, we would break." Helen realized then that Cornelius had convinced Ida she was responsible for the other's survival. That belief was harder to remove than chains. Meanwhile, the district attorney prepared to pursue additional charges. Murder, trafficking, fraud. But there was a problem. Bodies alone were not enough. Records had to match. Cornelius had used letters for his earlier subjects. Names changed, locations shifted, but patterns existed. One of the notebooks referenced subject D. The entry ended with relocation. No burial, no termination, just relocation. That word haunted the investigators. They cross-referenced dates. A child disappearance in eastern Idaho matched the timing. A boy taken in by a religious labor group and then vanished months later. The group claimed he ran away. No proof otherwise. Another entry mentioned consultation. Cornelius had written about meeting someone who shared his beliefs. Someone who believed children needed to be broken before being rebuilt. The notebook did not give a name. Only a phrase. The work continues. That phrase changed everything. Cartwright realized Cornelius might not have been alone. Not just teaching through example, but communicating, sharing ideas, possibly exchanging children. The possibility sent shockwaves through the investigation. A single abuser was horrific. A network was unthinkable. Federal authorities were notified. Quietly. No press. No panic. Agents began reviewing similar cases across frontier states. Unexplained child deaths. Isolated farms. Men who preached discipline and purity. Patterns emerged. Not proof, but enough to be afraid. Back in Winnemucca, Cornelius learned about the expanded investigation. For the first time, he smiled. A guard later reported that Cornelius seemed pleased. As if validation had arrived. He requested a meeting with the prison chaplain. Not for confession, for discussion. He spoke calmly about the weakness of modern society. About the failure to raise strong children. About how ideas could survive even if people did not. The chaplain left shaken. Shortly after, Cornelius attempted to harm himself. Not seriously. Not enough to die. Enough to send a message. He wanted attention. He wanted relevance. The court ordered increased monitoring. All writing privileges revoked. Cornelius responded with silence, which terrified everyone more. At Helen's home, progress continued slowly. Clyde learned to draw. Virgil learned to ask questions. Nora learned to cry. Ida learned nothing new. She watched Helen constantly. One night, Helen awoke to find Ida standing beside her bed. Ida spoke quietly. "If he comes back, I will protect them." Helen held her tightly for the first time. Ida did not resist. That was the first true breakthrough. The investigation pressed on. Graves were re-examined. Records rechecked. Old witnesses interviewed. And then came the final piece. A letter from Colorado. A man imprisoned for child abuse claimed he had learned everything from someone named Brennick. He said Brennick taught him that pain created order. That fear was the purest teacher. That children were clay. Authorities now knew the truth. Cornelius Brennick was not just a monster. He was a teacher, and his lessons had already spread. In Part 6, the story follows the hunt for those who listened. And the race to stop the Brennick method before more children vanished. If you want to know how far this darkness reached, stay with us. Because the worst discoveries were still ahead. Part 6. The method was already loose. The fear changed shape the moment investigators realized Cornelius Brennick had not worked alone. Until then, the horror had a boundary. A farm, a basement, a single man. Now that boundary was gone. Sheriff Cartwright read the Colorado letter again, slower this time. The prisoner had written calmly, almost proudly. He claimed Brennick had shown him how to break resistance. How to remove will. How to build obedience that lasted even in silence. The words were too familiar. They matched the notebooks. They matched the children. Cornelius Brennick had not just acted. He had taught. Federal authorities stepped in quietly. No public statements. No newspapers. Too many questions without answers. They created a small task force and began comparing cases across frontier states. What they found was chilling. Isolated farms where children never appeared in town. Religious labor camps where children worked without schooling. Households where discipline crossed into ritual. In most cases, the evidence was not enough for arrests. The law lagged behind cruelty. Psychological abuse was difficult to prove. Isolation was still legal. But patterns emerged. Men who spoke the same language. Order, purity, strength, obedience. Words Cornelius had used. Meanwhile, Cornelius sat in his prison cell, perfectly still. He did not speak to guards. He did not request visitors. He did not write. That silence felt intentional, as if he were waiting. Helen Pritchard felt the danger in a different way. The children were changing. Clyde began asking questions about the past. Small ones. Safe ones. What was school like? Why did people sing? Why did food taste different every day? Virgil started building things with scraps of wood. Crooked towers that always fell. He laughed when they did. Nora began having nightmares. But she talked afterward. She described darkness and counting breaths. She let Helen hold her until sleep returned. Ida remained distant, but something inside her was shifting. She no longer corrected the others openly. Instead, she watched, listened, absorbed. Helen worried about what Ida was becoming. Doctors advised patience. Trauma did not release its grip easily. One afternoon, Ida asked a question. It was simple. Why did he pick us? Helen hesitated before answering. Because you were vulnerable. Ida nodded. He said that made us special. That answer frightened Helen more than any nightmare. Across the region, investigators followed faint trails. Some led nowhere. Others ended in buried secrets and quiet graves. But a few pointed toward living threats. In Idaho, a farm was raided after neighbors reported children never seen outside. Inside, authorities found restraint marks on walls. No chains. No notebooks. The owner claimed discipline. He mentioned learning from a man in Nevada. In Oregon, a former labor overseer admitted using methods taught by a quiet traveler years earlier. He described it as a philosophy. Children were easier to mold when broken early. The phrase appeared again. The work continues. Cartwright understood then that Brennick had believed he was part of something larger. Not an organization. An idea. Ideas did not need meetings or leaders. They spread quietly. In prison, Cornelius finally spoke. He asked to see Cartwright. Against advice, Cartwright agreed. Cornelius looked thinner but calm. His eyes were sharp. You found them, Cornelius said softly. Cartwright asked who. The ones who listened. Cornelius smiled. I told you. Systems last longer than men. Cartwright demanded names. Cornelius laughed quietly. Names are unimportant. Belief is enough. The meeting ended abruptly. Cornelius was placed under stricter isolation. That night, something happened that shook Helen deeply. Ida disappeared. For less than an hour. But it felt endless. She was found sitting outside the house in the dark, arranging stones again. Helen wrapped her in a blanket and brought her inside. Why did you go out there? Helen asked. Ida answered honestly. I wanted to see if I could leave. Helen held her tightly. And, Ida paused. I came back. That was the moment Helen realized Ida was beginning to choose. Slowly, painfully, but truly. Days later, federal agents uncovered another connection. A small pamphlet circulating among fringe groups. It preached discipline and isolation. It spoke of raising children beyond weakness. The language mirrored Cornelius almost word for word. The author used a pseudonym. But investigators believe the ideas originated with Brennick. Whether he wrote it or inspired it no longer mattered. The method was spreading. Authorities moved faster now. Quiet warnings. Welfare checks. Legal pressure. Some children were removed. Others vanished before help arrived. The damage was already done. At Helen's home, progress accelerated unexpectedly. Nora asked to learn to read. Virgil asked why rules changed. Clyde asked if he could have a toy. Ida watched all of it. One evening, Helen overheard Ida speaking to the others. Her voice was calm, soft, but different. If something hurts, we can say it now. The words were clumsy, but they were revolutionary. Helen cried silently in the doorway. The children were learning something Cornelius never wanted them to learn. Choice. Meanwhile, Cornelius attempted suicide again. This time, it was serious. He survived. Barely. Doctors concluded it was not despair. It was control. If he could not shape the world, he would try to manipulate it through crisis. Writing privileges were permanently revoked. No visitors allowed. Cornelius responded by staring at the wall for hours. Guards reported he whispered occasionally. Not prayers. Instructions. The investigation culminated months later with several arrests across multiple states. Men influenced by Brennick's methods. Some cooperated. Others denied everything. Not all children were found. Some never would be. The Brennick method did not end. But it slowed. That mattered. For Ida, Nora, Virgil, and Clyde, life would never be normal. But it would be theirs. On the anniversary of their rescue, Helen asked Ida what she wanted to do next. Ida thought carefully. I want to forget his rules. Helen smiled. That is the hardest rule to break. In part 7, the story turns inward. The long road of recovery. And the secret Ida would finally reveal about what Cornelius feared most. Stay with us. Because the deepest horror was not what he did. It was what he tried to create. Part 7. What Cornelius feared most. The truth did not come out all at once. It arrived in fragments. In pauses. In half-spoken sentences that ended in silence. For months after Cornelius Brennick was removed from their lives, the children existed in a strange space between fear and freedom. Their bodies were safe, but their minds were still locked inside the system he had built. Doctors called it long-term conditioning. Helen called it living with a ghost. Nora began to speak more often, but only in whispers. Virgil asked questions, but always followed them with apologies. Clyde started laughing, then would suddenly stop and look around as if waiting for punishment. Ida remained the most distant. She followed rules that no longer existed. She woke before dawn. She counted steps. She measured food portions even when told not to. But slowly, something changed. She started watching people instead of watching doors. She listened when Helen spoke, not just to obey, but to understand. The breakthrough came on a quiet afternoon when rain trapped them inside. Helen was reading aloud, not expecting the children to follow the story. It was a simple book. Nothing demanding. Just words and pictures. Ida interrupted. Why do stories end happy? Helen closed the book. Because people need hope. Ida thought about that for a long time. That night, Ida spoke again. He hated stories. Helen felt her chest tighten. Why? Because stories teach people to imagine something else. That was the moment Helen realized Cornelius Brennick's greatest fear was not exposure or prison. It was imagination. Over the following weeks, Ida began to share pieces of the past. Not memories in order. Not full explanations. Just fragments that slipped out when she felt safe enough. Cornelius had taught them that thinking was dangerous. Questions were disobedience. Dreams were lies. He said imagination made people weak because it created desire. Desire led to disappointment. Disappointment led to rebellion. So he erased it. Games were forbidden. Stories were forbidden. Names were eventually replaced by numbers to remove identity. Ida explained that the pit was not the worst punishment. The worst punishment was silence. No work, no light, no counting, just waiting. Waiting until thoughts stopped forming. Cornelius believed that once a child reached that state, they were ready. Ready for what? Helen asked. Ida did not answer. She could not. The doctors noted Ida showed signs of something rare. Survivor leadership. She had learned to survive by becoming useful to Cornelius. By enforcing rules on the others. By believing she was responsible for their safety. Letting go of that role felt like betrayal. Meanwhile, the wider investigation continued. More cases surfaced. Some were stopped in time. Others were too late. Cornelius Brennick's influence was confirmed in at least 6 states. Not through direct contact in all cases, but through shared ideas passed quietly among isolated men who believed the world was rotting. The newspapers never printed his name widely. Authorities feared copycats. But the silence did not erase what he had done. In prison, Cornelius deteriorated. Not physically, mentally. Without control, he unraveled. Guards reported he argued with himself. Corrected invisible mistakes. Stood at attention for hours. The system he built had consumed him too. Back in Winnemucca, the children began therapy sessions focused on choice. They were given small decisions. Which cup to use, which shirt to wear, where to sit. At first, these choices caused panic. Then discomfort. Then curiosity. Clyde was the first to choose freely. He picked a red toy horse. Virgil chose to sit by the window. Nora chose to sleep with the light off. Ida watched all of it. One evening, Helen asked Ida what she wanted. Ida stared at the floor. I do not know how. Helen waited. After a long silence, Ida said something that changed everything. I want to make something that does not have rules. Helen brought paper and colors. Ida drew slowly. At first, straight lines. Then curves. Then shapes that did not repeat. When she finished, she pushed the paper away as if afraid. Nothing bad happened. That night, Ida slept through until morning for the first time. The next revelation came unexpectedly. During a medical review, Ida asked to speak privately. When Helen stepped out, Ida told the doctor something she had never said before. Cornelius was afraid of one thing. That the children would care about each other more than they feared him. He punished kindness. If one child helped another, both were punished. If someone cried, the others were forced to watch. He wanted isolation even within the group. But it did not fully work. At night, they whispered. Tiny sounds, breaths, signals. They learned each other's presence without words. That bond saved them. Ida admitted something else. There had been another child at the farm when she was younger. A boy. He was older than her. He tried to escape. They never saw him again. Cornelius told them the boy had failed. Ida believed him. Until now. This revelation reopened the case. Authorities searched old records again. They found a missing child report that matched Ida's timeline. The boy had vanished from a nearby county years earlier. No body was ever found. The possibility remained that he escaped. Or that his grave was still hidden. For Ida, the uncertainty was both pain and hope. He might have survived. That thought mattered. As months passed, the children slowly began to build identities separate from Brennick's rules. Nora learned to sing. Virgil learned to read. Clyde learned to trust. Ida learned to rest. One day, Helen asked Ida what she thought freedom meant. Ida answered carefully. It means he cannot tell me what to think anymore. That was victory. But healing was not complete. Trauma did not vanish. It slept. And sometimes, it woke. In prison, Cornelius Brennick suffered a stroke. He survived but lost the ability to speak clearly. Doctors said his mind was slipping. Before losing coherence, he repeated one phrase over and over. They will fail without order. They will fail. He was wrong. In Part 8, the story reaches its final investigations. The unanswered graves. The child who may have escaped. And the last secret hidden beneath the Brennick Farm. Stay with us. Because the past still has one more truth to reveal. Part 8. The ground that still remembered. Some places never forget. Even when buildings fall. Even when people leave. Even when years pass. The Brennick Farm looked ordinary in the morning light. The house stood empty now. Windows boarded. Doors sealed. The barn leaned slightly, tired from time. Grass had grown wild where children once labored in silence. But the ground remembered. Sheriff Cartwright returned to the property with a larger team. Federal agents, surveyors, specialists trained to read soil like history written underground. They were looking for what was still missing. The boy Ida spoke about. And the others who were never numbered. Ground-penetrating equipment swept the land slowly. The machine beeped softly as it rolled across the fields. Most signals were rocks, old fence posts, broken tools buried long ago. Then one reading stopped them cold. Behind the tree line, past the barn, near a place where the soil dipped unnaturally. They marked the spot and began digging by hand. Carefully, respectfully, less than 4 feet down, the shovel struck something solid. Wood, old boards, arranged deliberately. The air changed as the soil was removed. A smell rose, faint but unmistakable. The doctor knelt and examined what remained. A small skeleton, older than the others. The bones told a story without words. This child had not been buried. Immediately, the soil around the ribs showed signs of compression. The body had been placed alive. Cartwright closed his eyes. This was not discipline. This was ritual. As the dig continued, more items surfaced. Rusted shackles, fabric remnants, a small carved object shaped like a bird. Ida's drawing flashed through Cartwright's mind. Curved lines, wings, freedom. The team documented everything. Nearby, they uncovered another grave. And another. Some remains were incomplete, scattered, as if moved or disturbed. The count grew. 7, 9, 12. This was no longer a series of isolated deaths. It was a system. Back in town, Helen was told the excavation had resumed. She did not tell the children. Not yet. Ida already sensed something was happening. She had become sensitive to changes in tone, to silence, to the way adults avoided her eyes. One evening, she asked directly, "Did you find him?" Helen hesitated. "We found children." Ida nodded slowly, not surprised, just tired. Authorities worked around the clock. Old adoption records were pulled. Church registries, mining camp logs, birth records with missing follow-ups. Names began to appear. So did dates. Cornelius Brennick's timeline extended further back than anyone had believed. At least 15 years. Possibly more. He had refined his methods over time. Early victims were experimental. Later ones were controlled. The boy Ida mentioned matched one set of remains. Age, height, bone growth. But one detail did not align. The grave showed signs of disturbance years after burial. Someone had dug into it. And then stopped. That suggested doubt, or interruption, or fear. Investigators considered the impossible. What if the boy had survived? What if Cornelius believed he had buried him, but had not? The idea sent a ripple through the task force. Survivors meant witnesses. They released a quiet inquiry through law enforcement channels. Not public, just targeted outreach. A few days later, a lead came from California. A man in his 20s. Former drifter. Scars on wrists and ankles. Deep fear of confined spaces. He remembered being locked underground as a child. He remembered dirt collapsing. He remembered crawling. Then nothing. He had woken days later near a river miles away. A trapper found him and took him to a settlement. No records were kept. The man did not know his name. But he remembered one word. Cornelius. Cartwright traveled immediately. The meeting was brief, painful, but undeniable. The man recognized a photograph of the Brennick Farm. He pointed to the tree line. "I crawled that way." The truth hit hard. One child had escaped, and Cornelius had never forgiven that failure. Back in Nevada, Cornelius lay in a prison hospital bed. His speech was slurred, his body weakened, but his eyes remained alert. When Cartwright mentioned the survivor, Cornelius reacted. His breathing changed, his hands shook. No denial, no anger, just fear. That confirmed everything. Cornelius Brennick had feared proof of resistance more than death. The survivor chose not to testify publicly. But his statement was recorded. It sealed the case. The remains were identified as best as possible. Some would never have names. But they were no longer forgotten. A memorial was placed quietly near the farm. No speeches, no crowds, just stones with dates. At Helen's home, the children felt the shift before they understood it. Nora slept more peacefully. Virgil stopped flinching at loud sounds. Clyde asked fewer questions about punishment. Ida stood outside one evening and stared toward the horizon. Helen joined her. "They found him," Helen said softly. Ida did not ask who. She already knew. Did he live? Yes. Ida closed her eyes. Something inside her released. Not joy. Relief. He made it. That night, Ida cried openly for the first time. Not in fear. In grief. In prison, Cornelius Brennick died weeks later. A second stroke. No last words. No confession. No redemption. His death made little difference. The damage had already been done. But his story was finally complete. Or so it seemed, because among his remaining papers, investigators found one final notebook. Hidden. Unfinished. It contained references to someone else. A successor. A person he believed would continue the work. The name was redacted, but the implication was clear. Cornelius never believed he was the end. In Part 9, the story turns toward that final threat. The person who learned too well. And the race to stop history from repeating itself. Stay with us, because some horrors do not die quietly. Part 9, the one who was taught. Evil does not always die with the man who created it. Sometimes it is taught. Sometimes it is trained. Sometimes it is waiting. The final notebook found on the Brennick farm did not contain dates or numbers like the others. It was different, smaller, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the basement. Cartwright felt uneasy the moment he opened it. The handwriting was the same precise script, but the tone had changed. This book was not about control. It was about continuation. Cornelius had written about failure, about weakness, about mistakes he believed he had corrected over time. Then came the references. The apprentice, the successor, the student who understood the work. No name was written, only descriptions. Older than the current children. Strong, obedient, intelligent, able to suppress emotion completely. Someone who had learned discipline so deeply that punishment was no longer required. Someone who had been sent away. This changed everything. Until now, investigators believed Cornelius worked alone. That he isolated himself completely. That his cruelty ended at his property line. The notebook suggested otherwise. Cartwright assembled a new task force. Quietly, carefully, they reviewed Cornelius's movements over the years. His supply routes, his letters, his time spent away from the farm. One pattern stood out. Every winter, for nearly a decade, Cornelius had traveled east for several weeks. Sometimes longer. Always alone. He claimed he sold produce and livestock. There were no sales records to support that. Another detail emerged from the survivor in California. The man remembered one other boy. Older, silent, watching. He was different, the survivor said. He did not cry. He did not fight. He did not try to escape. He listened. That boy was never listed in the notebooks as a subject, which meant he was never considered expendable. That boy was being trained. The task force expanded the search beyond Nevada, Montana, Utah, Idaho, California, anywhere Cornelius had passed through. They looked for patterns of isolated farms, remote religious communities, child labor operations hidden behind frontier ideals. The results were chilling. 3 properties showed similarities. Extreme isolation, no schooling, no visitors, no children seen in public. Each location had records of a man arriving years earlier. Quiet, disciplined, structured, not Cornelius, someone younger. In one Utah settlement, a preacher remembered him clearly. He did not speak much, the preacher said. But when he did, he spoke about order. About correcting sin early. About breaking the will to save the soul. He had no family. No past, no name that could be verified. He left suddenly. Authorities began to understand the scale of what Cornelius had attempted. He was not just controlling children. He was creating something, a philosophy, a method, a lineage. At Helen's home, the children sensed the tension again. Ida noticed the adults whispering. The locked doors at night. The way Cartwright visited more often. Something is still wrong, she said quietly. Helen did not lie. Yes. Ida nodded. He taught someone else. Helen froze. How do you know? Ida looked at her hands. He used to make one of us watch. The room felt smaller. Watch what? Punishments. Training. When asked who, Ida shook her head. I was told not to remember his name. That confirmed it. The apprentice had been among them. And he had learned too well. The task force received a breakthrough from Idaho. A deputy reported a disturbance at a remote ranch. Screaming heard at night. A child seen running briefly before being dragged back inside. When deputies arrived, the property was empty. But the basement told the story. Restraints. Discipline charts. Handwriting that matched Cornelius's perfectly. The system had been copied. Improved. Modernized. This was no imitation. It was inheritance. Cartwright felt something close to failure settle in his chest. Stopping Cornelius had not been enough. They had only cut the head off something that had already taken root. Days later, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office. No return address. Inside was a single page. The writing was familiar. Too familiar. You stopped the teacher. But the lesson remains. Correction is mercy. Weakness must be removed. There was no signature. But pressed into the paper was a symbol. A crude bird. The same shape Ida had drawn months earlier. The apprentice knew they were watching. And he wanted them to know. Authorities increased protection around the children immediately. Federal marshals were involved. Their location was kept secret. Ida was told nothing. But she felt it. He is close, she whispered one night. Helen asked how she knew. Because he never leaves work unfinished. Across the country, the man who had once been a child sat in silence. He read the news carefully. He studied how fear moved people. He smiled when they spoke Cornelius's name. Because he believed he was better, smarter, more patient. He had learned not just how to control children. He had learned how to hide. Part 10 will bring the final confrontation. The truth about who the apprentice became. And whether the cycle can finally be broken. Subscribe. Stay with us. Because this story does not end easily. Part 10. The last secret of the Brennick Farm. Some stories refuse to end quietly. Some truths sit beneath the soil, waiting for the right hands to uncover them. The Brennick Farm had kept its darkest secret for decades. 4 children had survived Cornelius's tyranny, but the shadow of the past stretched further than anyone could imagine. Investigators now faced a final question. The apprentice. The child who had been trained alongside Ida, Nora, Virgil, and Clyde. Was he still alive? Had he continued Cornelius's work? Or had the years alone broken him too? Cartwright assembled his team one last time. The surviving children, now under protective care, were safe. But the authorities knew the danger had not vanished. Every clue pointed to one remote cabin in northern Nevada. Hidden, isolated, a mirror of the Brennick Farm, but smaller and more precise. The cabin had signs of occupation. Smoke from a chimney, footprints leading to the edge of the forest. Tools laid neatly outside. No children were visible. Inside, the furniture was minimal, almost sterile. Shelves contained notebooks similar to Cornelius's, but written in a slightly younger hand. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, but the tone was colder, sharper. Every detail suggested that the apprentice had not forgotten. Had not stopped. He had learned the lessons Cornelius had failed to finish teaching him. Cartwright entered cautiously. Each step echoed in the quiet cabin. On the wall, a chalkboard displayed a list. Names, ages, tasks, and punishments. Rules enforced as if a shadow of Cornelius himself had returned. The team split. Some searched the upstairs. Others inspected the basement. There, they found a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. A small, dark space, enough to contain a child. Straps, restraints, and remnants of clothing hinted at recent use. And then they heard it. A voice. Calm. Controlled. I know why you are here. The words came from the shadows. A man stepped forward. Slightly taller than Ida, lean, his eyes sharp with intelligence and danger. Cartwright froze. This was the apprentice. The boy who had survived Cornelius. Now a man who had perfected the system. I have nothing to hide, he said, but there was a steel edge to his tone. Everything you fear is already documented. Everything is prepared. You cannot undo what I have learned. Cartwright spoke first. We are here to protect the children. To end this. The man laughed softly. End it? You mean stop it from happening again? You cannot stop it. It is not just methods or rules. It is a belief. A way of seeing the world. Cornelius did not teach cruelty. He taught control. I learned it because it works. I survived because it works. Helen stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. You are a grown man now. Children are not tools. They are human beings. You have to let them go. The apprentice's expression softened, just slightly. But the coldness returned almost immediately. They are not mine to let go. They are not ready. Only discipline ensures survival. Only rules keep them alive. Cartwright signaled his team. Federal agents moved swiftly but cautiously, surrounding the room. There could be no misstep. Any sudden action could trigger violence. I know you trained children like this, Cartwright said. You are not safe. Authorities are watching. You cannot continue. The man smiled faintly. You do not understand. I am the system now. Cornelius is gone. The farm is gone. But the method lives. And it cannot die because it adapts. It evolves. At that moment, Ida stepped forward. She had come with Helen to witness the investigation. She did not speak at first. She watched him closely. Then she said, quietly but with strength, you do not control me. You never did. And you never will. The apprentice flinched. For the first time, doubt crossed his face. Years of indoctrination could not account for the resilience he had never expected. You were like me, he whispered. You understood. You learned. Yes, Ida said. I learned. But I chose something you cannot teach. Freedom. Choice. Love. That is stronger than fear. The cabin was silent. Then the man sank slowly to a chair, staring at the floor. The team cautiously secured the room. There were no children found. Only evidence that someone had been held there. The apprentice had been living in preparation for the next generation. He had been ready to continue Cornelius's work indefinitely. But the investigators had arrived first. The cycle was broken. The notebooks, the basement, the hidden compartments, all were seized. Federal authorities promised lifelong surveillance. The apprentice would be prosecuted. And the risk to any new children would be eliminated. Outside, Ida looked at the mountains. She breathed deeply. She had survived Cornelius. She had survived the apprentice. And now, finally, she could begin to imagine a life beyond fear. Helen put a hand on her shoulder. You are safe now. Ida nodded. She did not speak immediately. But when she did, it was with a quiet conviction. We remember, but we are not trapped. Not anymore. We can live. Cartwright stood watching. Justice had not been simple. Pain had not been erased. But the cycle that had begun so long ago, in the isolation of the Nevada frontier, had been stopped. The land would remain scarred, but the children who survived could rebuild. They could tell their story. And in telling it, ensure that no one forgot. If you have followed the story of the Brennick Farm, you know now the full scale of the horror, the meticulous cruelty, and the resilience of human spirit. Remember, history is not just about what is written. It is about what is hidden. And sometimes, it is the survivors who reveal the truth that cannot be buried. Thank you for joining us in uncovering this story. Do not forget to subscribe for more investigations into the darkest corners of American history. Share this story to keep awareness alive, and comment below to let us know where you are watching from and what part of the story shocked you the most. The Brennick Farm is gone. But its lessons remain.